Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how U.S. government policy affects your bottom line. I'm your host, Rachelle Akuffo, and of course, we're just a few days away from President-elect Trump being sworn in as a new president, and we're already seeing some reaction as a reality of the new incoming administration and some of the policies that have been tossed about start to come to the fray. So we're going to be looking at some of the market's response, and we're also going to be looking at some of the key issues, whether it's tariffs and immigration, and really the impact of what's ahead for the U.S. economy. So, of course, I want to bring in my co-stars, Ben Werschkul and Rick Newman. Of course, later on, we're going to have Rachelle Akuffo from Bipartisan Policy Center joining us to also flesh out some of these. But I want to first start with Ben and what's on your trusty note cards this week.
Yay, good to be with you guys. So what I have on my card is Trumponomics 2.0. So the markets, as you mentioned, the markets have been waiting, guessing, speculating, hoping, whatever on Trump, and it's here. But depending on when you're listening to this, the inauguration is just going to be a few days away. And one kind of through line of the week I thought I could highlight to start us off is an increased kind of market volatility and attention to Trump and sort of what's going on around his orbit. It's obviously going to be a taste of just what's to come next week after the inauguration itself. Three quick examples for you guys. First is tariffs. We've had about 2 weeks now of a kind of semi-public debate about tariffs. What is Trump going to do on tariffs? You know, we see these plans floated clearly from his aides. They haven't even been presented to Trump of, you know, maybe it's going to be a little more friendly, maybe it's not. We don't know. And the markets are reacting to that. You're seeing the dollar go up and down in response to that. And that's clearly because this is one of the big uncertainties for Trump going forward. A second is kind of interconnected issues of inflation, the national debt, and taxes. Again, this is a place we're beginning to see even more attention from the markets. The bond market is clearly kind of nervous about whether Trumpflation is in the offing, and we're seeing things move there. And then the third, because of course we need three for a trend, is the kind of close market attention this week to Scott Bessent, who had his confirmation hearing to be Treasury Secretary, and it was kind of everything because of all this uncertainty around Trump. A lot of attention there about what signals he's sending. Is he gonna be a defender of tariffs in Trump 2.0, even though he's offered critical commentary in the past? So all of these together kind of show kind of just a little taste of what's I think is to come on the markets and Trump, and kind of a volatility that we all remember from 1.0 to 2.0.
So I've been looking at what you just mentioned has been happening in the bond market. You can't fake the bond market, and the bond market is nervous right now. And we're seeing that in this strange divergence between what's happening with long-term interest rates, which you can think of the 10-year Treasury bond as a proxy for that, and what's happening with short-term interest rates. So the Fed has cut short-term rates by a percentage point during the last 4 months since September. And during the same period of time, the 10-year has gone up by almost the same amount. So the short-term rates going down, long-term rates going up. That's unusual. It's not necessarily any single thing, but it is mainly it's a concern that we're going to have higher inflation in the future, not lower, but higher inflation. And why might that be? Number one, economy is pretty hot. We saw that with a really strong jobs report for December. But without a doubt, another factor is markets are worried about what's going to happen with the Trump tariffs. If they go into place as Trump has threatened to put them in place, they would probably push prices up and generate inflationary pressure. Trump also wants to deport migrant workers. That means labor costs could go up as we have fewer workers. And then there are concerns that we might finally be getting to the point where the U.S. National debt is just too big. And it's going to start having negative effects, which will be a different cascading problem. So we're finally going to get to the point when Trump takes office that we're going to stop speculating about some of this, and we're going to start to find out what Trump's actual policies are. So I say bring it on. Let's get this show started and see what's actually going to happen. But Ben, maybe you could just talk a little bit more about what Scott Bessent, the incoming Treasury Secretary, has had to say about tariffs, because a year ago he didn't like tariffs, right?
Yeah, for sure, Rick. As you mentioned, it was less than a year ago that in a letter to his hedge fund, he talks about tariffs being inflationary. And what we saw this week in his confirmation hearing was a kind of Wall Street version of what Trump talks about on the campaign trail. He was a defender of tariffs. He talked about how kind of Trump tariffs are going to be a three-pronged strategy. One is to stop unfair trade practices. One is to stop other geopolitical issues. And a third is what he called a generalized tariffs, or a blanket tariff on to raise revenue, which is what Trump wants to happen. The markets are really nervous about that. But this is clearly sort of in some form is going to be on the agenda. And Trump even went further this week and talked about an external revenue service, in addition to the internal revenue service, that would be a kind of clearinghouse for the amount of revenue he wants to bring in. So they're clearly there's an element of tariffs that are negotiating ploy, and Bessent talked about that today. But there's an element of here that they just want to change the kind of budget landscape of the U.S. through tariffs. And there's a lot of skepticism as right now tariffs are about 2% of U.S. revenues.
I wish we could find out.
It's interesting because we did get some of the color on Bessent's ambitious 333 plan. And Rick, I know you've been taking a look at that and really sort of digging into it. It makes for a nice catchphrase, but break that down for us and what the reality actually looks like.
Do you guys remember 999?
I do.
And of course you do. Herman Cain. I mean, so this is like 1/3 of the Herman Cain. Take Herman Cain's 999 and just divide by 3. That's for political geeks. Okay, so Scott Bessent's 333 plan. Most people probably don't know what this is, but he says his goal is to raise GDP growth, real GDP growth, adjusted for inflation, to 3% per year. He wants to reduce the federal deficit to 3% of GDP, and he wants to add another 3 million barrels per day of U.S. oil production. So I have been going through all of these things and saying, well, where do we actually stand right now? And what's the likelihood that any of this could ever happen? And I hate to disappoint Scott Bessent or anybody who likes this idea, but 333 is going to end up being more like 271. It's not going to be 333. I'll just very briefly go through each of these. So GDP growth of 3%. GDP growth during the last, since 2010, has averaged about 2.3%, and the Congressional Budget Office thinks it's only going to be about 1.5% during the next 10 years. And there are reasons for that. I mean, we have slowing population growth, we have declining immigration, we have an aging society, and those things all push growth lower, not higher. So I'm not sure what magic button Scott Bessent's going to push that basically doubles GDP growth from 1.5 to 3%, but he thinks he will. So number 2, let's go to the federal deficit as a percentage of GDP. Right now, the deficit is about 7% of GDP. Now, he wants to push it down to 3%. But guess what? Trump's talking about fully extending the tax cuts that expire at the end of this year. That would add more money to the national debt, not lower it. And again, the Congressional Budget Office thinks that not even factoring in any deficit spending by Trump, we're going to be at 6 or 7% of GDP for the foreseeable future, not 3%. And getting from 6% deficits to 3%, really hard. That's a ton of cutting. That would piss off a lot of people. Finally, oil production. We're at record levels of domestic oil production right now. It's about 13 million barrels per day. So add 3 million, you're getting up to 16 million. Again, forecasters just don't think that's going to happen. They think we might tick up a little bit, but guess what? The energy firms that would do all this extra drilling don't want to. And the reason they don't want to is they like oil prices where they are. If you put more oil on the market, the price goes down and their profits decline. So even though Trump's going to be friendly to the fossil fuel industry, not too many people think we're actually going to see a big boom in U.S. energy production. So good. I hope I hope we get to 333. It's worth trying. I just don't think anybody should think it's realistic.
And so one of the things that they were talking about in the Bessent hearing was really the impact of tariffs. Obviously, we knew that tariffs were going to be front and center there, but they also talked about eliminating the debt ceiling. There were a lot of things thrown around. We did see some bipartisan agreement, especially from Senator Elizabeth Warren there. Obviously, I'm not sure people quite understand. There are quite a few legislative steps required. This isn't a snap of the fingers sort of thing. But there are some key dates coming up that people should really keep in mind beyond the inauguration and obviously some of the day one issues. Ben, what do you think we should be focusing on right now in terms of what's coming up?
Yeah, so there is, as you mentioned, there's a lot of deadlines coming up on this debt ceiling issue. Our guest coming up will be. Well, I definitely want to ask him about that. But we have a budget process that will try to avert a shutdown that happens in March. They're talking about a reconciliation bill in April, and then this debt ceiling that could come a few months after that. And overall, the conventional wisdom has been that the debt ceiling is going to be kind of an easier lift because Republicans are in full control, which I think is largely still true, but it's getting more complicated by the day. Trump kind of tried to get it into the December back and forth unsuccessfully, but what he did succeed in doing was making it possibly part of the reconciliation bill. And for a lot of technical reasons that we don't have time for on the podcast, that's tough because you basically need an entire Republican all the Republicans to then vote for it. And there's a lot of Republicans who part of their brand is not to vote for the debt ceiling. So it's going to be a kind of ongoing thing. Bessent today was sort of funny on it because he both defended the debt ceiling a bit as a premise, but then talked about if Trump wanted, he'd get rid of it. So it's going to be a kind of an issue that crosses a lot of paths, and it's not exactly clear the process to get it done. And it'll get lifted eventually. Bessent said as much today, but it could be kind of a lot between here and there.
Everybody should read Ben's stories because he covers every bit of this in detail. And when it happens and you need to know about it, Ben will tell you. That's how I find out about it.
That sounds most of us. Ben is our guru over here. Now, we are going to be talking to our guest, Shai Akabas, on the other side of this break, so do stay with us on Capital Gains. Welcome back to Capital Gains. We want to now bring in our guest, Shai Akabas, Bipartisan Policy Center Executive Director of Economic Policy. Thank you for joining us on Capital Gains. First, I want to start with a key discussion, and obviously because of the deadlines coming up, the debt ceiling. Now, we saw in discussions today during Bessent's hearing this week about eliminating the debt ceiling. What do we know about how that math would work and what the repercussions would be?
Well, thanks so much for having me. The debt ceiling limits the amount that the federal government is allowed to legally borrow. That doesn't really matter, except that it causes panic in the financial markets when they think that we're not going to be able to afford to pay our bills. And by when I say when it doesn't really matter, it's not an economically significant figure in and of itself, because we've already committed ourselves to doing the spending, and this is just allowing us to borrow to pay those bills. Now, the rub this time around is that markets and credit rating agencies are already getting nervous around the size of the debt that we have. And eliminating the debt limit wholesale could cause them to have further concern that we are unlikely to address that underlying problem that continues to grow in size. I think you're going to hear that from a lot of congressional people on both sides of the aisle, particularly Republicans. And ultimately, I think a debt limit deal could have an element that addresses the underlying fiscal problem paired with the debt limit. And so we've seen that in the past where there are these negotiations between the two parties to get to a debt limit extension. This time around, there's talk of it going through the reconciliation process and being passed only with Republican support. That would be an anomaly when it comes to history. And I think ultimately there's a decent likelihood that it requires both parties to pass. And then you get into these conversations about what gets tacked on. And could you see an element that gets tacked on that de-risks the debt limit for the future? So it effectively would eliminate the risk that we see, but also has a fiscal element tied in. So that requires a debate to happen regularly about how we're going to address the growing debt problem that we have as a country.
Shai, I want to push harder on this question of what if we just got rid of the debt ceiling? I mean, you know the history of this, I think, probably better than any of us. But the reason this went into effect decades ago was not to police the amount of borrowing. It was just to create one authority for total borrowing, so the Treasury didn't have to come back to Congress for every time it wanted to borrow money. And now it's gotten to it's gone to the other extreme, where once every couple of years we seem to have this threat of a default. And in those downgrades from the credit rating agencies that we've gotten so far on U.S. debt, mostly they've not really said the U.S. is borrowing too much. They've said we're downgrading because of political dysfunction, which seems to be a direct reference to the showdowns, to these risks of default. And if you got rid of the debt ceiling, you still would be piling on the debt, which we seem like we're going to do anyway, but you would just be you would not have these periodic risks of default. So what is wrong with that?
You make a great point, Rick, and I think there's two responses. One is, it is absolutely true that the debt limit in its current form is an ineffective form of budgeting. It's part of the budgeting by crisis that we've gotten into as a country. It's the debt limit, it's the government shutdowns, it's the continuing resolutions, it's the inability to just control our fiscal picture. But what's also true is that the credit rating agencies in their recent warnings have pointed to the fact that the dysfunction in governance is going to lead to an inability to actually address our debt problem. And I am concerned that just waving the debt limit away eliminates this at least stoppage point where we confront the fiscal picture that we have and have a discussion about it. Now, the discussion today is highly inefficient because it's not usually about solutions to that budget problem, which largely revolve around fixing the entitlement spending that we have as a country and the tax code that we have to bring in enough revenue. They often fall on a small portion of the budget that's not really driving the problem anyway. But I am concerned that ratings agencies are going to grow increasingly alarmed about our inability to deal with the underlying problem if resolution to the debt limit is not paired with some type of fiscal rectitude, be that actual policies that improve the picture or a process that gets us to debate the underlying causes and solutions to the problem. So that, I think, is the nice marriage where, yes, we should de-risk the debt limit and it should not pose this constant sort of Damocles for our economy, but doing so in a way that is mindful of the fiscal situation we find ourselves in is the right way to do that.
What's your assessment at the moment of the atmosphere in Washington in terms of its ability to take on these fiscal challenges you're talking about here? A couple signals we've seen this week. One I saw you highlighted, which is a plan from a Republican. His name is Jody Arrington, that actually talks about painful cuts, talks about big things that we could trim to actually get this under control. Another one to flag too is that the top tax writer, Jason Smith, seemed to signal that the tax bill that's coming could not be paid for basically because they think tariffs are going to bring in so much money, which I think budget watchers are going to question for sure. I guess given these different signals, what's your sense of kind of your hope of responsibility here in the months ahead?
Well, I'm enthusiastic that we're taking a comprehensive look at our tax code because we do that all too infrequently. We only do it when there's these massive bills that come on the table and there's actually a debate about the underlying tax code. What I think is important in this moment, in this inflection point for fiscal policy, this is a year, as was noted, there's going to be recurring opportunities to address the fiscal picture. The tax cuts legislation is going to be perhaps foremost among them. And in the context of that, we need to think about what is tax policy that is conducive to economic growth, that is supporting working families and businesses, but is also fiscally responsible. And for that reason, we are thinking about policies that can help pay for tax cuts that Republicans want to extend. We should be looking at the most economically powerful elements of TCJA to extend. And to offset that, we should be looking at things that don't cause a huge economic drag. Pairing those together will result in a package that maximizes the economic growth that we get from these tax reforms and also minimizes the drag that we'll get from a growing debt burden.
So Shai, in that regard then, obviously you look at a lot of different formulas of models here. What are the top three most viable ones that will cause at least the least damage to the economy or perhaps offset?
We know that legislators are already starting to talk about this and look at specific policies, some of which BPC and others have been putting out there. So, for example, on the state and local tax deduction, this is a huge issue for many Democrats and Republicans, and particularly important for the Republican constituency that is part of their conference that is prioritizing this from primarily states that have high state and local taxes. And they would like to keep that deduction, or restore it, I should say, to a higher level than it is today under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act level, which is limited to $10,000. We have put out compromise approaches where you could perhaps lift it for married couples that are to a level that is over that $10,000 level, but maybe even trim it from the $10,000 level, or at least keep it at the $10,000 level for singles. There are other numbers being thrown around like $100,000 or higher. That benefit would largely go to high-income families. You could also limit the state and local tax deduction for corporations, which is sort of a distinction that is currently in the tax code. They are still allowed to deduct those state and local taxes without limit. So that's one place that I think is going to be central to Republicans' ability to get agreement. There's other places that they could look at to make the tax code more efficient. So, for example, the charitable deduction, extremely important, supports a lot of critical causes around the country. But right now, that only goes to people who itemize their deductions, and that's a very small portion of the tax-paying population. Could you democratize that and curtail the benefit a little bit at the higher ends, provide it to more people, and save a few dollars in the process without dramatically affecting charitable giving? I think there's a formulation there that could be a viable option on the table. So it's items like that that can help pay for some of the tax cuts that Republicans are interested in doing. I don't know if those will end up carrying the day, but there's lots of items on the menu, and what responsible members of Congress should be looking for is to pair those with the tax cuts that they want to drive forward.
Shai, there have been so-called bond vigilantes warning about a U.S. debt crisis for years, and perhaps you could even say decades. Do you think this is it finally? I mean, people are now looking at what's happening in bond markets with these long yields going up a little bit. Is that the beginning of the debt crisis? Are you not sure? If it's not, how will we know when the debt crisis is here?
Fantastic question. I am increasingly concerned that we are getting close to that tipping point. The most frequent question I get is, what is the level? Right now we're at about 100% of GDP, meaning that debt held by the public is about the size of our economy. That's a very high level. It's almost unprecedented in US history, and we're headed much, much higher than that. When do we hit that point that it becomes a huge problem and we start seeing really dramatic market reactions? Is it 110%, 120%, 150%? We don't know. What I am fairly confident of is that we have passed the point where we could hit some type of major economic downturn or unforeseen event. Think of COVID, think of the Great Recession, others, that causes us to need a forceful federal response. And in that federal response, we may need to take into account what those bond vigilantes or what the markets are going to do as a reaction. That's not a strong position for us to be in as a country. When we have to determine our response to a crisis of the moment by what others are going to do in reaction to that, it means that our response is not being dictated by the fundamentals of the crisis itself. It's being dictated by the broader exogenous economic circumstances. And we don't want to find ourselves in that situation. That's why we need to get our arms around this problem sooner rather than later. To date, we've been the proverbial frog in the pot where the water is getting warmer and we think it's just feeling nice and cozy in there until it gets too hot where we start to burn. And I'm afraid that we're going to get to that point before we realize it. And only when we realize it are we going to have to start implementing really dramatic policies that are not in the best interests of our economy and our country moving forward.
Before we let you go, Shai, I wanted to end on a perhaps more upbeat note that if the proverbial pot here doesn't boil before we get to that point, your group really looks at bipartisan policies that might be under the radar that could be areas of agreement. What are you looking at that we're not talking about? What are you looking at that could be an area that might surprise us in the years ahead, where the parties could come together, if there's any?
Yeah, it's really important, Ben, because amidst this, there are so many issues that we can be working on constructively together. And the reason why this deficit problem is so concerning, in addition to what could turn into more of a crisis, is that it's preventing us from focusing on the investments and the other elements of legislating that we should be doing to secure American families, to make working easier for American households, for parents in the economy. So I think that working families agenda, we've heard it loud and clear from the last election. Both parties, I think, have, that those kitchen table issues really drove the day. And members of Congress are focused on trying to make improvements there. Most of those, though, cost money. So it's important to think of those in the context of the fiscal picture. But when we look at policies like the child tax credit and paid family leave and childcare, affordable childcare, those are all things that help parents go to work and be productive members of the economy, help support workers, and create a more robust economy for the future. Another one is small business. We just put out a big agenda for small business earlier this week, and that is an issue that I think could drive legislating in Congress where both parties feel the need to support businesses and create conducive conditions for them to thrive in an economy that will end up ultimately helping everyone and also improving our deficit picture, because part of the answer to the deficit problem is economic growth, and policies like immigration and labor market supports and lots of others, energy policy, those all factor into that element.
From the BPC, thank you so much for joining us
Thanks,
here on
Shai.
Capital Gains.
Appreciate it.
Well, that does it for this episode of Capital Gains. A big thank you to Shai, Rick, and Ben for joining us today. Now, make sure you like and subscribe Capital Gains, and be sure to tune in for Yahoo Finance's special inauguration coverage on Monday. You won't want to miss it. We'll have special guests giving their business and finance takes, so be sure to tune in. But that does it for this episode of Capital Gains. We'll see you next time.